about cats, not the Broadway play, and particularly Grumman cats. And this actually, I think, one of the few times I actually have Cobey here actually talking about U.S. aircraft, which it's something you probably know the most about. And then I keep having you on about other things that you know the least about, it seems.
Oh well.
But when I started doing research for this, I think it was brought up a few times in our conversations how Grumman was a kind of a weird company, and they were kind of an offshoot, and they became a official business in like 1929, building truck frames. And then
Okay.
they were on to making floats for the Navy for tractable landing gear in them.
Yeah.
And then they came up with their kind of little float planes. I think was the Duck was one of theirs, little Grumman
Yeah.
Duck.
Well, it wasn't one of their first airplanes,
No,
but
but I
yeah.
mean they were like specialty was like that kind of seaplane thing
Yep.
for a little bit.
Yeah. The reason why is they were out on Long Island. Long Island. So there's lots of water around there, so they stuck to amphibious airplanes and stuff like that. Plus, I think Leroy Grumman actually just liked the whole idea of airplanes floating in water to begin with.
Just okay. I was gonna say it floated his boat, but pun intended.
Yeah.
So then, and today, what's kind of weird is that there's a bunch of you see Grumman things every day here in the states, and I never noticed it was their stupid little post office trucks that run around here that you see every day.
Yeah, actually, Grumman they still make aluminum like this. The step van was their idea, and so was the metal canoe. And actually, actually, now that you mention it, the aluminum canoe is kind of what kept the company alive between the wars. They were built on the same production line that the airplanes were built on, using the exact same tools, the exact same materials, and it kept a bunch of people employed during the lean years.
And then they built airplanes, and we're gonna talk about the cats in a minute, the whole series of cats. But then they made the Avenger, or I guess they made a batch of Avengers. There's several companies that made
Well,
Avengers throughout the war,
the
but
Avenger is their design. They were so busy with Hellcat and Wildcat production that they had to.
it was Boeing,
Um,
right, that stepped in with some
no, a company called Eastern Aircraft,
Easter. Okay,
which is actually GM,
that's what it is. Because the
built it.
GMTBM is it right? GM.
EBM is yeah. M is the Eastern Aircraft designation for airplanes that were built by Eastern. They also built Wildcats.
Right, and then there was the Skyrocket, which was their experiment.
Yep,
That kind of all the information they learned from that went into the Tigercat is
that's correct. Yep.
connection. And then later on, they built the F-14 Tomcat, and I think the A6 Intruder might be theirs, if I remember off the top of my head.
No, they built the Panther. They built the Cougar.
That Cougar, that's
They
what I was thinking of. That the electronic warfare package thing. That's what I'm thinking of. Anyway,
okay. They also built the F-11 Tiger. They have a long history of Navy airplanes. The F-14 was the last airplane that they built for the Navy, though. Built the Grumman E-2 Hawkeye.
I'm sorry, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, and the C-2 Greyhound. They built the S-2F Tracker, which is arguably the best anti-submarine airplane ever built. They also built the Albatross, which is the last float plane that was in U.S. service. Or the last amphibian airplane that was in U.S. service, I should say, flying boat.
So the thing to take this away is that they built little post office vans. I think they did fire trucks too at one point.
Yeah.
Truck
Yep.
frames, canoes, and then they had the world's best contract with the U.S. Navy that nobody else seemed to get their hands on for the longest time.
Yeah, well, part of the reason is because Leroy Grumman understood the Navy, and the Navy understood him, and so he just agreed to their terms, regardless of what they were, pretty much every time, and he delivered every single time.
Well, he made a crap load of
So,
aircrafts for them, so it worked
yep,
out.
yep.
All right, so let's start with the Wildcat, which you and I have had this debate several times. You like the aircraft. I kind of
I love the
despise. I
airplane.
kind of despise it. I think it's one of the few aircraft that we probably have such a huge disagreement on. I was doing some research, and All right, so evidently the early on Wildcat was underpowered. This is the
Yes.
research I was doing. The Wildcat, the F4 F-1 is actually a biplane variant. Was reading. I didn't know this.
Yeah, what it was the Navy did this really stupid thing back in the 30s and into the war. As soon as they got a successful airplane, they instantly started work on its replacement. And so what the original biplane Wildcat was a replacement for the F3F, the Flying Barrel.
Flying Bear. Okay.
And they were working on it, and then Grumman said, hey, we can make this into a monoplane. The Navy said, okay, and that's how it started.
Right, and then they built the prototype of the monoplane Wildcat, which they lost the contract to Brewster for the Buffalo.
That's correct. Yep.
because the plane was too heavy and they had an underperforming
Mm-hmm.
engine in it.
Yep.
And so yeah, because correct me if I get into this wrong.
Yep.
And then they came out with the Pratt Whitney 1830.
1830. Yeah, the original ones had 1830s. Later Wildcats had the right 1820 in it.
And so I'm never gonna do a podcast about the Buffalo. So the Buffalo was put into service, and it's kind of a dinky little aircraft. Um, you would think by War Thunder it's a god, but in real life the thing got shredded.
It's severely overperforming in War Thunder, and the Wildcat severely underperforming in War
agree with
Thunder.
that, but
In
anyway,
real life,
I don't
it was
agree with
just
that.
it was just the opposite.
Anyway, the Wildcat was built in desperation to replace as many buffaloes as possible because the buffaloes were getting slaughtered.
And the Navy had problems with the Brewster Company. Several Brewster executives ended up going to prison for all sorts of nasty stuff because they were stealing money from the Navy, and they weren't delivering airplanes, and the Navy actually had to give Brewster a loan at one time to keep them in business because they just got rid of they spent their money on other stuff instead of building buffaloes like
real
they
quick,
should have.
I'm going to run through the variants, then we're going to run through some history, and then we're going to run through why at least the positives and negatives to the Wildcat.
Okay.
So first off, we had the Dash 1, which was the biplane. Dash 2 was the plane that lost the contract to the Buffalo. The Dash 3 was the one that was put into service with the 1830 engine with a two-stage supercharger.
Yep.
And then there's a Dash 3S, which I think is hilarious because it's called the Wildcat fish.
Yeah, with the floats on it.
Yeah. There's a float plane Wildcat.
The zero on floats really shocked us. They first saw that up in the Aleutian Islands, and it's actually a float plane fighter is perfect for
you don't need
the
the
Aleutian
airport.
Islands. Exactly. You can just find a little cove and park it in there and be done. It really surprised us. So they sent Grumman a contract to try to get the Wildcat on floats, and it didn't work out very well.
I still want it War Thunder at some point, even as a premium plane. That might be a great premium plane.
I agree.
So there's the Dash 3. And to my knowledge, the Dash 3 was kind of rushed into service. It didn't have the things that need to be a proper carrier plane. It did have a tail hook, right?
Of course it had tail hook.
But it didn't have folding wings.
No, it did not.
And
actually, the original Wildcat did not have folding wings.
And then the British got a bunch of Wildcats, Dash 3s, and they did dislike the machine guns on it. It only has 450s, and they demanded that second set of 50s on there, so that's when it became 6.
Yep.
And it's kind of weird because I guess there's a wing spar because you have the 4, and then there's this huge gap, and then the last 50 is like way out in the wing by itself.
Yeah, it is. It's because, well, the original airplane was built with only 4 machine guns in the wing at all, so they had to find room for it. So
even though the Dash 4 is a newer variant, it's actually slower than the Dash 3 because of all the added weight.
It's heavier, much more armor, everything else. Yep.
All right, so we're gonna go into a little bit of history, then we'll do the positives and some numbers at the end of this. Now I will dog on the Wildcat here in a minute, but the thing about the Wildcat, why it's famous for U.S. naval history, is there was a lot of very brave pilots who did some amazing things with it. First off, the Thatch and Weave tactic came from Thatch, of course, who the Wildcat could never outrun or outclimb. The only thing it could do is really outdive Zeros, if it could ever get to a point where it had an altitude advantage. So the U.S. pilots had to quickly come up with tactics to try and outsmart and outmaneuver the Japanese pilots. So that's where Thatch and Weave came out of. And then there's another gentleman I'm going to talk about called Henry T. Elrod. You know who that is, Cobey?
No, I never heard of him.
All right, that is they're in the defense of Wake Island, which was falling at the exact same time as Pearl Harbor, or Pearl Harbor was bombed and then Wake Island was invaded, and the U.S. Navy was in complete disarray. And this, I believe, and I could be wrong on some of the facts here. It's been a long time since I've seen a documentary on him, but I believe Elrod was the parachute instructor. He was either a major or captain. He came in as the parachute instructor. He was delivering 12 Wildcats to the island. And the Japanese hit, and they didn't expect it. And so he flew, I think it was him and a wingman were the only 2 trained officers at the time to fly Wildcats. And there's, and so there's several instances where the one thing that's written on his Medal of Honor citation is there's one engagement where he single-handedly attacked 22 Zeros that were coming towards the island.
That's crazy.
Shot down 2 of them.
That's insane.
Shot down 2 of them. And he did this for almost 20 days of just fighting like this. And then he was also the first U.S. Pilot to sink a warship, he dove bomb a Japanese destroyer by himself, and so
That's
on. And he
insane.
just did everything he could to keep that island going. And there was all the Wildcats. There's some famous pictures out in the net if you guys look this up. There's Wake Island. You see like a pile of Wildcats in just disarray because he would just basically crash land them, grab a
Grab
sandwich,
another one.
yeah, and grab another Wildcat. And then it's very sad though. Guy was just. I mean, you just talk about sacrificing everything. And then the Japanese invaded at night. I think it was December 20th something. He actually stood on the beaches and tried to organize and fought the battle. And I believe he died escorting a machine gun crew emplacement. Like he got winged by a bullet and he died of his wounds shortly thereafter.
Oh.
But yeah, no relief was ever sent to those guys. So all the people from Lake Island, of course, were put into POW camps. But this guy is a Medal of Honor winner, after the fact. And his airplane, if you ever go to the Smithsonian Museum, there's a Wildcat sitting there, and they took as many parts of Wildcats as they could find off Wake Island to build a one to commemorate him there.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
That's
so you
cool.
ever see a Wildcat there that has battle damage to it and rust? It's all the parts. They didn't really do much restoration to it. They wanted to leave it as it was.
Awesome.
So anyway, that's the type of stuff I respect about the Wildcat. I don't necessarily like the plane. I respect the people who flew it. All right, so the Wildcat. We'll talk about the good parts of it. Like I said, it is a faster diver. It does have a faster roll rate somehow with those goofy ass box wings than the Zero, and all this is compared to the Zero, of course. It carries more ammo than the Zero, minus the two 20 millimeter cannons. Even though Zero has 120 millimeter. So
20 rounds.
yeah, so you're looking at more 50 caliber ammo. And it was durable and it protected the pilot, and the Zero had no protection. And there's some cases of Zero pilots who would actually. I was reading one of the testimonies last night about a Japanese ace who was like, "Yeah, we used to just shoot buffaloes with the 7.7s because they fall apart." And then we sneak up on a Wildcat, we dive. It's like I drove 500 to 600 rounds through the tail of the Wildcat, and I flew up next to it, and the thing is flying fine. The elevator and the rudder are completely torn to shreds, and the pilot just looks at me and he's like, "I'm out of ammo. All right, bye." So the Wildcat can take a beating, and I think the damage model War Thunder is pretty proper for it. Especially the Dash 3, which it sees eye shacks and it doesn't instantly usually catch on fire or break in pieces because it's an all metal
Yeah.
wheel belt plane.
Yeah.
I will give it that. The problem I have with the plane is that the canopy sucks balls. I'll use that word term, sucks balls. The canopy sucks. The visibility is absolutely awful.
Yeah. Well, the visibility out of the real airplane was pretty shitty too.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. It's a goofy canopy.
Yeah.
And I know U.S. design was behind the canopies on all fronts, but I think the Wildcat had an extra bad canopy.
It had a lot of glass. The problem is that it had real small panes of glass, so there's a lot of window framing around it.
And you also can't see anything behind you. You
Yes,
see nothing behind you.
that's correct.
Short range, didn't carry much fuel.
Carried enough.
Uh,
They could also put drop tanks on it, which is not a War Thunder
right. It had a bad climb rate compared to the Zero. The Zero had
because it was
heavy.
twice as heavy.
Right, and a little bit underpowered.
Yeah.
And it also was slower in the acceleration. These are all things that
Because it was
help in
heavier.
the turn fight or any type of fighting. And the
Oh,
last
yeah.
thing that always pissed pilots off I was reading is the narrow landing gear.
Yeah.
Because that's those
Well, yeah.
kind of goofy landing gear that comes straight underneath the fuselage instead of the wings.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's just my. And I've seen a Wildcat in real life, and you just kind of look at it and goes, "Oh, it's small. It's actually smaller than you would think." Or at least to me.
Built around the engine. Yeah, yeah, it is. Well, yeah, it is a pretty small airplane. I mean, it's a carrier airplane. They built airplanes small for carriers back then.
But for Grumman's first, the U.S. and I'll say this nicely, all the U.S. companies were behind. Fairchild, the Republic put out the P-35 first, and that was kind of a disaster. And then you had this thing, which was kind of a disaster. You had the Brewster Buffalo, which was a disaster. You had the P-36s. I mean, like all the initial planes built by these companies weren't the greatest. So
No.
I might hold it to
Technology was changing so much then, and we really didn't know what the Japanese had. The Zero really surprised a lot of people.
Zero surprised the Russians, it surprised the Australians, the British, us.
Yeah.
I mean, it just wiped. And so, like I said, the Wildcat just. Now, how did the Wildcat do in the European theater? Because there was some of those shipped over there. Do you have?
Well, they were on escort carriers. They actually did really well because there wasn't really anything that was fighting against them. They were mostly escort um, for the Avengers and everything else like that. My dog's barking in the background. Sorry, there's a squirrel outside.
All right. So
So yeah, they attack U-boats and stuff like that. They didn't really go up against a lot of fighters because there weren't very many fighters in the North Atlantic.
and the last stats I'll just throw out some numbers before we move on to the Hellcat. About 7,900 of these things were built, so it's not a small uh, thing whatsoever. The number I found was 34,000 foot service ceiling, or 10 kilometers.
Yeah,
Who the hell would take a Wildcat up that high?
actually, the Dash 3 was 37,000, I think.
Good God. So the Dauntless doesn't even go that high, which it normally escorted.
No,
What the? Okay, whatever.
because it had a big ass turbocharger on it.
I know
Or
it just seems
supercharger.
obsessive. Like, anyway. And it had a really kind of 2,200 feet, or 11.17 meters a second climb rate. So it's nothing special in that department.
You know, it's still pretty good, but it's not as good
Not what it
as
fought.
other airplanes. Yeah.
Not what it thought. I mean, unfortunately, it's gonna be compared to the Zero because that's what it saw on an almost daily basis. Hellcat, which is one of my favorite planes, which in War Thunder, it's not very big in the War Thunder community, and I think,
Because it's a piece of shit in the game. That's
well,
why.
yes and no. Yes, I'll go that way. It still doesn't have a proper flight model. It flies around like a kite. It's really weird, and the rudder doesn't do much.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
it's also because I think, well, at least with the U.S. players, like the war in Japan was isolated from a lot of the European, like let's say if you're a British player or a Russian player or a German player, you really could probably give two shits about the U.S. Navy, especially in the Pacific Theater airplanes. But for people who study U.S. history, the Hellcat was one of the most dominating animals out there.
Yeah.
And
I would argue that it was probably the best fighter of the war. Period.
I would have loved to see what this plane would have done against 109s and 190s and strength, just as a
Probably would have done pretty good actually.
science experiment. So there was real quick. 1943 was introduced to replace the Wildcat, and there's actually some kind of neat history behind the Hellcat. The Hellcat has an R2800 2,000 horsepower engine, same engine that's in the Bearcat, the Tigercat, the P-47, the Corsair. You probably name off 30 other aircraft that have that
Everything.
engine.
The most produced aero engine ever, except for except for the engine that's in the Cessna 172.
The plane was built though simple and straightforward. Unlike the P-47 was like a technological marvel and it was expensive. The Hellcat, they kept everything as simple as possible and it was armor, guns, and engine.
Much.
So Hellcat was actually meant to supplement the U.S. Navy at first, and they had the Corsairs. We could talk about the Corsair a little bit. The Corsair hit service in the Navy. Was it first? The 1A?
Technically first, yeah, but there were a lot of problems
They
with it.
hated the Corsair. It was bouncing too much.
We couldn't land it on a carrier because it would bounce off the edge.
And so they took Hellcats. They took delivery of Hellcats as a supplemental temporary fix.
Stopgap measure.
And the
yeah.
Hellcat never gave it back. And the Corsairs were all given to the Marine Corps for land use.
In the beginning, yes.
Yeah, but you see majority of the carriers and the big carriers, the Enterprise and so on, were using Hellcats for 99% of the war. At least all the footage I've ever seen, the real footage, I've always seen Hellcats on those things. So that's how it kicked off the Corsair, and then this is insane. Here's the numbers I was going to read you. Why the Hellcat's an absolute animal. Had 5,200, almost over 5,200 kills, more than any other naval fighter of World War II, and they only lost 270 of those. So that's a 19-to-1 kill to death ratio.
That's pretty good.
Now 270 lost, which could have been lightning, a bird, it's not 270 lost to combat. It was
and non-combat.
yeah,
accidents,
that's
yeah.
insane. Two, it produced, was it 305 aces or something? Yeah, 305 aces were produced in the Hellcat, and I think it's pretty nuts. And then the best part, why I love this plane, I love planes that are multi-versatile. And so after it owned the skies, it became a fighter bomber, dropping napalm, Tiny Tims, strafing the beaches, and just doing everything it could to support the Marines on the beach. And also, Hellcats were famous for attacking whenever there was naval fights. If there was no fighter cover for the Japanese fleet, the Hellcats would fly and load, even strafe the decks of the ships without fear, trying to get the Japanese off the decks and confusion and so on. So, very versatile aircraft that saw a lot of service. had some other numbers. There is about 200 pounds of cockpit around the armor, and then I believe it has a ton of bulletproof glass around it too. Is it the front, back, or?
Well, I know that the front glass was armored. I don't think the side glass or anything else
The
was
side
armored.
glass
But there
usually
was
isn't,
a big,
but then there's a big steel plate behind them.
yeah, there's a huge armor plate behind them.
So you have all that greatness going. So there's right now the Dash 3 in game, which was the first model put into production. And then there's the Dash 5. There is a couple mistakes in War Thunder. We talked about the flight model. The flight model should be pretty much closer to a P-47. I guess it should weigh a lot more.
Yes, I would
But
agree,
the beauty
yeah.
of the Hellcat, and for all the people who, like, I see so many people in the forums talk about, oh, the Zero, the Hellcat killed my, or the Zero killed my Hellcat. Well, you have to, when the Hellcat has a different type of way of killing things, it outclimbs you, it accelerates you, and outruns you. When you can engage and disengage with your enemy at will, then you just basically make him your bitch and do whatever you want with him, and he can't retaliate. Whenever you slow down and try to match them on their level, their lighter, aircraft, blah, blah, that's how you lose. And I think that's one reason the Hellcat isn't as prevalent to War Thunder players as much as it is, because they don't understand how you have to use a Hellcat, because it's a very specific type of fighting. Two, it's way underweight, which sounds stupid, but the plane flies around like a kite. You heard me say that. And so if you're ever in a Hellcat in the game and you try to dive, it's like its nose slowly rolls over, and it's like you have to force it down because it doesn't have that weight to push it down to get into that initial dive. So there's some really funky stuff with the flight model. I don't think its damage model is quite right, but it's still a fun plane. It's still under tiered as hell, but until it gets that flight model, it's fine where it is because it's not being overly spammed, I guess. Whatever. Anyway.
I like it. I fly it a lot.
Yeah, but it's more of a novelty
I like
at
the
this
British
point.
one. The British one is actually a better airplane just because it's a premium airplane. Of course, you get more stuff at the end, but
so there's the Dash 3,
It's
which
pretty
was the
cool.
production model,
first production model, yeah.
and then there's the Dash 5, and then that's it, to my knowledge. You have
Yep, that's correct.
this plane
Yep,
did not need mini field modifications or any at all, and they didn't do a lot in the ways of variants. I think how many variants of the P-47 was there?
1.5 million. Well, I mean, there were a lot of variants. There were night fighter versions, there were floater recon versions, and stuff like that. But they were all just pulled off the production line and modified. They weren't new models.
So the Dash 3 endgame has WEP, which is incorrect because the Dash 5 is supposed to be the plane with water injection. This is one of the few planes that actually has, you guess you call it proper WEP, water injection, which is like a 5-gallon bucket of water or something that.
I don't know how much it
Anyway,
is. Yeah,
I think
it's
it's
water
5 gallons.
methanol.
But yeah, it injects into the engine, blah, blah. Wasn't really good for the engine, but if your life was on it, you hit that button and go.
What it's there for.
It had strengthened ailerons, strengthened elevator, strengthened rudder. I believe that was just more aluminum, or was it just reinforced or somehow? I'm not sure on that.
Reinforced, yeah.
It had another
Probably
200 horsepower that they added to that engine, so it's a different model of the R2800. Top speed this guy was 380 miles an hour, 621 kilometers. Rate of climb was 3,500 feet and 17 meters a second, so much, much better than the Wildcat, and the Zeros never saw us coming. And real quick before we move on to the Bearcat, wasn't the Hellcat based off the Zero that crash landed in the Aleutian Islands, and then they kind of did some testing and they learned what,
I don't know about that.
I thought the story was that they got
took some information.
right. They
about
got
that. I don't know.
this is at least what I've heard. There was a Zero that crashed in Aleutian Islands. There are pictures of it, and it was flipped over. I believe they got put back together and running again, and they did some testing, and they found out this is the acceleration we need to beat. This is the dive. They got the test numbers off of it, and then they built the Hellcat to exceed all of those numbers. That's what I've heard. I don't know if there's a lick of truth in that.
That's very possible. I don't know. I know that it was pretty much designed to kill the Zero in the first place.
Yeah, that was its sole job, and it did it well.
Yep.
All right, so we have the F8F, and we're all getting. Well, this is all leading to the Tigercat, which is coming to the game soon. I don't think we actually need to spend a ton of time on the Bearcat. The Bearcat entered service in 1945. There's some confusion about this as well because it's really low tiered in freaking War Thunder right now, and the flight model keeps changes.
It's ridiculous.
It didn't actually see combat service, but it was delivered before the war ended. About 4 or 5 months before the war ended, the Bearcat was delivered. It never saw combat though.
Yeah, I think it was delivered to the Navy in
May.
like February or March of 45.
Wait, it was delivered in February, operational in May, and the war ended in
makes
September.
sense.
It never had a chance. The one thing I didn't understand about the Bearcat was it was built as an interceptor to go high altitude, and it was supposed to shoot down kamikazes.
Hmm?
Was that the whole, I guess, premise of it?
Kinda, yeah. It was meant to, yeah. The Navy didn't have really anything that matched the Mustang or the anything like that.
So they made a lighter, faster airplane essentially, and I
Yeah,
don't know
basically
where that
what they
went.
did is it's basically everything um that was learned from the Focke-Wulf 190 was put into the Bearcat.
Um,
If that makes any sense.
what else did it have? I'm trying to remember. It had a better climb rate and it was lighter. That's all they wanted, but it still had pretty crappy range, right?
Yeah. Yep.
It's the same engine, like I said. Didn't see combat. Did have the M3 machine guns in it, and this is where it's kind of weird. The F8F-1, there's only like 650 of those built, and then there was the 1B with cannons. There's 100 of those built. There's the Dash 2 that isn't in game, which had improved like metal work, I guess, to it. Had improved cowlings,
Had a taller
taller tail,
rudder.
yeah, right, and then it had 4 20 millimeter cannons on it as well. There's 293 of those built, and top speed of this guy is 421 miles an hour. Rate of climb was 4,500, so it outdid the Hellcat. Um, but I don't know, it didn't see much post-war or any post-war service at all.
No, well, it kind of got caught up in the whole jet thing. Jets were on the scene, and there wasn't really any kind of need for. God, my dog's barking again. For a prop-driven fighter, the by that time the Navy had just started getting the Phantom and the Banshee and stuff like that. So its time was limited.
It actually saw more service as a racing plane, and I mean, there's a bunch of them there still kind of running around, isn't
Oh
there?
yeah, there's still a couple as racing planes. The French used them a lot in Vietnam. We gave a bunch to the South Vietnamese. Um, I don't know. We didn't use them very much in Korea. I
I
don't
don't
I
know
don't
any
know
instances
why.
of them in Korea.
Yeah.
All right, so we have the Tigercat, which is coming to game, which is why we decided to do this podcast before the next big update pushes that out. I have the developmental pictures in there as well, and the video should be coming up right about now. The Tigercat's kind of weird, I guess. I don't know. I've seen a lot of footage of this thing running in real life, and it seems to churn really well. It's gonna. I've already heard a little birdie has told me that it's churning way too well in this dev server,
Really?
and it's under tiered. So sorry, everybody else, you're gonna get spammed the Tigercat too.
Yeah. Too bad.
Um, well, anyway. And I guess
Just
if
more
if it's based
B-17
off
spam
anything
limit.
what the Skyrocket does in game, good God, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Four
Just
four
imagine it better.
twenties, 450 cals,
50.
two 1,000 pound bombs, and drops one torpedo. This is what's kind of weird, and I don't have much to say on the Tigercat. Hopefully, Kobe here can spread some more light. There was like 34 built of the original production model. I'm sorry, there's 364 built of the F7F-1, I think, and then there was like
Okay.
34 built of another model, and then there was Night Fighter variants. Anyway, there's like maybe 10 different variants of this thing, and there was like a handful
Yeah.
made
There's
of
a
each,
bunch of
and then
them.
there's only like 5 or 6 made of each.
Dash one, dash two, dash three, and dash four were the big ones. But in that, there were night fighters and
Two
Florida
seaters. I know
Recons,
that they
and
went to 2 seat at
there
some
was a
point.
drone controller. Yeah, there was all sorts of issues.
And that plane went out of service pretty quickly too, right?
Yeah, as far as the carrier airplane goes, yeah, the Marines used it really, really, really well during the Korean War as a night fighter, the Dash 3N, which I hope eventually comes to War Thunder. It was the best night fighter we had of the war. Period. It ran rings around everything else.
And then there was the
450s and 420s, man. You can't mess with it.
and that power. I guess the biggest thing about the Tiger Cabs we need to stress is that it had two R2800s
Yep.
strapped to it, which is, I mean, and it's
Lots of
and the
power.
plane is very sleek. The actual fuselage is very sleek and slender.
Yep.
So there's not much to this plane besides it's almost all engine, which is why there's a lot of appeal to it, and plus the firepower. And then it was used after war as a fighter, or I'm sorry, a fire bomber, right? Or
Yeah, up until the late 70s, actually, the companies that owned them were actually about 10 miles away from where I live now. They were used very successfully as fire bombers. In fact, I think all of the surviving Tigercats, except for one that's still flying around today, they were all fire bombers.
okay. Uh, and I said it like we could talk about the Bearcat and Tigercat more, but there was no real operational history to them. So it's just like, hey, they were produced, and that's all the data we kind
Yeah,
of
they
have.
just kind of kept on keeping on. That's it. They just kind of did their thing, and that was all.
So like I wish I could tell you more about those last two cats, but without there's no aces, there's no combat history, there's no you know what I mean. Even the Bearcat, there's a lot of I guess you call it test. One of the problems with the Bearcats that Gaijin's having is that there's a lot of test data and modified data, and people are like, well, here this Navy number says that this Bearcat climbs at this rate, and that could have been an experimental supercharger setting,
Yeah.
and so it's been really hard for them to find the proper data for the Bearcat, and so I'll give them a little bit of leniency on that. But the damn thing needs a proper battle rating because right now it's just murdering this game and it's not.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's gotten to the point where I don't even want to fly against
Well, yeah,
Americans.
you can't fly German, you can't fly British without seeing
Yep.
Bearcats and B-17s, and so, and the Bearcat should be put in that post-war tier with, let's say, LA-9s, Tempest 2s.
Yep, I agree.
It should be facing that, not. But
Hmm?
anyway, that's a whole nother discussion we'll get onto. If you guys have any questions about Grumman aircraft, I'll be watching this for a while, and then I know, Cobey has how many
Yeah,
books
yeah.
do you
Any
have sitting there?
questions? I got, I don't know, 2 Wildcat books, 2 Bearcat books. Yeah, I got a bunch of that
Collects them.
information.
So that's all that. Like I said, at the end, I'll put down the link. Guys can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, subscribe on YouTube. There's other crap, Twitch, yeah, all that great social media stuff. I'm told that I need to promote. But by Fierce, yeah, I'm really excited. Anyway, and
Our public affairs officer.
I think next week we should try and do the World War II movie discussion video or podcast finally.
Yeah, I'm ready for that. Absolutely.
So if you guys have any feedback on that or any questions about Grumman stuff, ask away. Thanks for listening.